December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy.
After Pearl Harbor, this is interpreted by average Americans as being an attack on the homeland, an attack on the American people, attack on American values, an attack that has to be avenged.
The nation is swept up in patriotic fervor as a result of the attack on Pearl Harbor. And African Americans, just like other Americans, are anxious to prove themselves in battle. They want to defend the nation.
Black men are volunteering to fight for their country. Some are drafted, but for the most part, they are enlisting. Because think about 1940s America. There are very few things that African Americans are able to do, particularly in the South. Ideas of social mobility and financial mobility is almost non-existent.
Here's Nazi Germany. They're fighting a war that is really defined by this idea of the superior white race. And African Americans have a vested interest in this war because they see it as an opportunity to strike a blow against fascism, but also an opportunity to gain freedom.
African Americans have served in every major war in the United States, and it's a desire to serve their country. It's a desire to prove that they're loyal to their country. It's also a belief that in serving their country in that manner, they might convince white Americans that they're deserving of full citizenship. And this is something that you see all the way back to the American Revolution.
There's this profound paradox of American slavery and American freedom, which argues that American freedom has always been dependent on slavery. In the same way, by the time we get to the Civil War and you have someone like Frederick Douglass writing, "What is the 4th of July to the slave?" He's making the case that this freedom, this equality, this liberty that you talk about has never been a part of who we are.
The idea that the enslaved or people who are oppressed will fight for their liberty is a very strong through line actually throughout American history. Basically, Black people are thinking about military participation as a tool for citizenship, as a tool for getting equal rights and fair treatment, hoping that their loyalty and their patriotism will be rewarded.
Pushing back against this, there's an infamous 1925 Army War College study which says that African Americans are physically and psychologically unfit for battle.
The military had always used these reports to not promote African Americans and to not give them the same opportunities to fight for their country the way white soldiers are.
This nation is asking for action, and action now.
When FDR is elected, there's the assumption that the Roosevelt administration is going to allow African Americans to participate in a more meaningful way in the military. There are two champions that help to push that along. One is the African American press, which has been making the case consistently. And the other champion is the president's wife, Eleanor Roosevelt, who is far more progressive than her husband. And so she's pushing him in a lot of ways.
African Americans are writing letters to the President of the United States, the First Lady, Eleanor, writing letters to the Black press, like the Chicago Defender, the New York Amsterdam News. There's a gentleman in the Pittsburgh Courier who writes a letter to the editor, James Thompson. He asks a question to the effect of, should I sacrifice to be a half American? And it's in this letter to the editor that he's suggesting that African Americans adopt the WWII campaign.
The WWII stands for double victory. And the aim is to have victory abroad and victory at home. And so it's a double fight for African Americans.
And it's a campaign that I think has a far-reaching impact. You're fighting against fascism, you're fighting against racial discrimination in private industry.
This is not just a war against the Nazis, it's not just a war against the Japanese. This is a war to make democracy real.
When the first Allied invaders reached France on D-Day, General George Patton was not among them.
Patton lands in Normandy after D-Day, and he's having a lot of attrition as he's fighting these retreating German rear guards. So he needs new tanks, he needs new tankers.
American forces find themselves undermanned and outgunned in many ways. They need fresh reinforcements.
As part of his plan to resume the offensive, General George S. Patton asked for as many tankers as he could get.
Patton is a typical racist of his period. He was very reluctant to see black tankers because he thinks it's a technical arm and that they're not going to be up to the job.
Patton said that he did not think that they could think fast enough to fight in armor.
Major Bates had actually trained under Patton, so when Patton sees these men perform, he recognizes that they may be able to help turn the balance for the war effort. And the color of their skin at that point is not his primary consideration. The primary consideration is how fast can I get them to Omaha Beach?
We lined up in a field in St. Nicholas, France, because we heard that General Patton was coming down to greet us into his army. Out stepped Patton, sparkling, dapper, stepped up on a half-track and said, "I sent for this unit because I heard you were good, and I have nothing but the best in my outfit. I want you to go up there and kill them goddamn Krauts. I don't care what color you are, as long as you go up there and kill those Kraut son of a bitches."
On November 8th, 1944, the 761st sees action for the first time. Ironically, the evening before, their commanding officer, Lieutenant Colonel Paul Bates, is wounded.
When Colonel Bates was wounded, Wingo became the acting battalion commander. And he was known for basically not doing anything. He was also known for using racial slurs. He wasn't the only one, by the way. The white officers in headquarters used to say that when the shooting starts, they'll run like hell. General Patton turned his attention to the offensive and taking the fortifications at Metz. Vixersai, Morville, Bazages-la-Petite, Bazages-la-Grande. Because the 4th Armored Division was pushing through that area, and they were concerned about enemy troops getting in their rear once they pushed through. So these towns had to be taken care of.
And so Patton, first he tries to maneuver north of Metz, gets blocked. Then he tries to go south. So the 761st gets pulled in when they're trying to flank it from the south. Metz is like the capital of Lorraine. And it was this old French fortress, which then became a German fortress city. And it has all these like suburban forts around it, basically placed outside of Metz to keep Metz from beyond artillery range of a besieger.
The Germans were the masters of defense. They knew how to build trench lines. They knew how to place machine gun posts. When it came to the Second World War and they swept through Western Europe in 1940, they started establishing similar defensive mechanisms, taking over towns, taking over hillsides to prevent any incursion from what would be the enemy, in this case now the Americans.
By the time the 761st Tank Battalion arrives, the Germans have sculpted this whole area into a really deadly killing field. And these places, the Hill 253, Morville-les-Vicq, these places were fortified bastions of the Metz position, where they're having to try to take these places so they can then force the Germans out of Metz.
The 761st, that was their baptism by fire.
General Eisenhower visits the Third Army, which is doggedly battling its way toward heavily fortified Metz. Our big guns open up.
To his credit, General Eisenhower wanted a very transparent army, and he encouraged journalists to be embedded with the troops. And so Trezevant Anderson was assigned to the 761st to cover their story.
Trezevant Anderson becomes one of 5 black journalists who were embedded with black soldiers during the Second World War. Anderson will have the honor of serving with the 761st and will document their battle heroics. In fact, if not for Trezevant Anderson, it's unlikely we would know many of the exploits of the 761st.
There was something eerie about that first day, for there was that very definite tension in the minds of all the tankers. There was that great unspoken question, what's going to happen? Will I make it? Will Jerry get me? And 1,001 other queries which yet were unspoken, but ran rampant in the minds of all.
Going into battle, the first thing they hear are these artillery rounds. You pound so much with artillery that you begin to feel sorry for whoever's on the receiving end.
The 761st Tank Battalion is, right there in the front line, attacking some of the key points in this perimeter defense of Metz. These are battles where really bloody and infernal battles.
The Americans are approaching the town of Vixersee. The Germans have put up a wire obstacle blocking their way because the Germans had those grounds heavily covered, not only with their tanks, but with their men. Staff Sergeant Reuben Rivers, in the midst of this intense gun battle, leaps out of his tank, grabs a cable, runs while guns are blazing all around him, hooks it to the wire entanglement that's blocking the tanks, hooks it to the tank, and pulls the wire away so the tanks can move forward.
He removes a barricade that was erected to prevent the tanks from moving forward. And he steps out of the tank and physically removes that barrier under enemy fire. Charles Wingo now is in charge, seemingly, but he is so spooked by the battle, so overcome by the prospects of war, that he hops out of his tank, hops in a Jeep, and is headed back to the rear of the lines.
And Wingo was nowhere near the shooting, incidentally. He heard about the shooting over the radio.
The man who had once questioned whether these black men were prepared for battle and questioned whether they'd had the mettle and the courage to stand up to the Germans now runs with his tail between his legs to safety as the 761st stand pat, ready to fight.